I have several goals tonight here, not too lofty goals, but I would like very much to give you a little bit about my background and kind of help you understand how I grew up and how I ended up doing what I do. And I'd also like to sort of fill you in on this series of work that started about 5 years ago that's sort of culminating in this exhibition. I'm not sure whether it will continue on, but it certainly will change quite a bit after this show. So it's kind of the end of a 5-year project, really, to bring all this work together in this show. And I made a kind of a video. It's just a collection of still shots that are put together on video for an award ceremony that I was very fortunate to be invited to be a lifetime member of the Glass Arts Society. And a number of very important people were going to be in the audience, and I was really terrified that I had to speak for an hour. So I made a 20-minute this video collection of slides, and I narrated it, and I put a soundtrack to it, which is the soundtrack from my studio. I have for 25 years been a huge fan of Mark Knopfler, the singer-songwriter and extremely wonderful guitar player. And I actually wrote to Mark Knopfler, and he gave me permission to use his music in this video, which amazed me that he would even answer my email. But I'm going to use parts of that video tonight to introduce you to my early work and to give you some idea of my influences. When I was in college, my professors used to say, you need to make your work more personal. And I never was exactly sure what that meant. I thought, how could it be anything but personal? I made it. But I think now that I'm beginning to understand at my ripe old age that it has a lot to do with experience. And in order for your work to be personal, you really need to incorporate your travels, major events in your life, profoundly joyous and sometimes profoundly sad events, and teachers, people that were mentors and really that you remember many, many years after taking a class with them. I think those are the influences that have changed me the most. Living in, every time I move to a new part of the country, or every time I've taken a long trip to Europe or Asia, my work has changed. And I think it's important for you to have a little bit of that background. So I'm going to introduce some of the sections from this little video and let you watch it and listen to Mark Knopfler. But I need to introduce them because this was designed for a glass knowledgeable group, and I'm pretty sure that many of you are not, really familiar with some of the names that that will be included here. So I'm going to introduce each section, or a few sections. There might be some things I need to say. The first section, all I have to say about it is that it's incredibly embarrassing. A friend of mine told me that it's a good idea to make a fool of yourself in front of a new audience. So in that spirit, here we go.
It all started with model airplanes, clubhouses, skateboards, and my dad's toolbox. Even as a kid, I was a maker of objects, but my first serious work as an artist was as a musician. The finest Christmas gift I ever received, a Gibson 12-string guitar, led to a garage band, after-school dances, and an actual recording contract. In 1967, I moved to Hollywood to play bass for the Mystic Astrologic Crystal Band. We were teenagers with fake IDs, occasionally playing in Hollywood nightclubs like the Sea Witch and the Troubadour, and a lesbian bar in the San Fernando Valley called It's Camp. We lived pretty much on the streets of Hollywood, which, by the way, were not all about peace, love, and understanding, even in the 60s, and we grew up fast. The band broke up. I was drafted, but due to some health issues, I was fortunate to escape the ravages of the Vietnam War. And in 1973, in the midst of the new renaissance of American craft, I began to study art and design at Cal State Fullerton.
Yeah, if I can make this work. This next section has to do with my introduction to stained glass. And there's a lot of mention of a person who's an international hero in the glass world, but not very well known outside that world. His name is Ludwig Schaffrath, and he is one of the most prolific and well-known architectural glass designers of the 20th century. And he literally has designed square miles of stained glass, literally, from right after the war, 1950, through the 80s. He helped to replace the stained glass in more than 800 churches that had windows destroyed in the war or were completely destroyed. And he had a profound influence on my career. He was my first mentor. And I want to mention that all of the stained glass in this section, it was made by me. And I'm talking about Ludwig Schaffrath, my teacher, and there's sometimes people get confused and they think that it's his work that you're seeing on the screen, but it's my early stained glass work.
I worked in ceramics and glass blowing at Fullerton with the great Jerry Rothman and the young Reese Williams, who had just graduated from Southern Illinois University. I also became interested in architecture and design because of a young professor named Sam Apple. Sam introduced me to the futurists, Buckminster Fuller and Paolo Soleri, and I completed the environmental design program. This being the 70s, I designed my own graduate program to study architectural stained glass. I wasn't sure what this all meant until I was selected to participate in the first architectural glass design class taught by Ludwig Schaffrath in the US. Schaffrath embodied everything that I wanted to do as an artist. His fresh, clean, contemporary graphic use of the lead and his massive, bold, elegant forms were the perfect complement to modern architecture. He absolutely understood his role as a bricklayer in glass. I was his teaching assistant in 1977 at the Pilchuck Glass School. It was a tremendous honor to participate in those early visits. Herr Schaffrath's design courses at Pilchuck and numerous other schools and studios throughout the U.S. over the next decade did for architectural glass much the same thing that Lino Tagliapietra's teaching would do for American blown glass. The square miles of stained glass walls that Ludwig Schaffrath has designed since 1955 surely place him near the top of any list of the most influential artists of the 20th century. I'm extremely proud to have had him as a teacher.
If you have questions, try to remember them and I'll do my best at the end. I think this next section is kind of self-explanatory. If I can figure out how to make it go away. Maybe that is all I need to do.
The first Schaffrath seminar in '76 was held in Berkeley, California. On that trip, I discovered a paradise called the Point Reyes Peninsula, about an hour north of the Golden Gate in Marin County. I was so taken with the pastoral perfection of the Point Reyes landscape that I raced back to LA from the Schaffrath class, sold my house, packed up my studio, and did the back to nature thing. I bought an acre, drilled a 65-foot deep water well with a gasoline-powered handheld drill, dug a septic system with a shovel, and lived in a 1950s single-wide trailer and spent many evenings sharpening my chainsaw by candlelight. Between 1978 and 1981, I hand-built a two-story, 2,000-square-foot pole-frame house, almost completely by myself. So once the bottom fell out of the residential stained glass market, it was 1982 in California, a little later in other parts of the country. I needed a new direction. I was teaching part-time at San Francisco State University in 1983 when Keiko Matsuo and Zunio Yoshimitsu invited me to teach for a semester at their new Tokyo Glass Art Institute. They had started the first all-glass school in Japan the year before, and again, it was my privilege and good fortune to be a part of something new. I spent about 5 months in Japan on that trip, and I've returned several times. I met Hiroshi Amano and Yuki Uchimura in '83, and I will be teaching with them at the Osaka University of Arts this spring semester.
In this section, I talk about my return to graduate school. I actually have 2 graduate degrees. I got an MA, or Master of Arts degree, at Cal State Fullerton, when that was the highest degree that Cal State Fullerton offered. And many years later, I was teaching in San Francisco, and for various reasons, I decided to return to grad school and put an F between my M and my A, and get a MFA, Master of Fine Arts degree, from CCAC. And that's where I met the other monstrously huge influence on my life, a man named Dennis Leon, who was head of the sculpture program at CCAC for 30-some years. And this section is a lot about him and his influence.
I met Dennis Leon when I returned to graduate school to upgrade to an MFA. Dennis changed my life and my attitude toward making more than any of my other teachers. Hardly a day goes by that I don't quote him or at least ask myself, what would Dennis have thought or said about that? He was an artist's artist. Dennis set the standard by which I measured other artists and teachers. He was as kind and compassionate a man as I've ever met, but he could be so brutal when he critiqued your work. Brutally honest, but never cruel. His vocabulary was intimidating, and he was without a doubt the brightest, most articulate observer of the creative process that I've had the pleasure to work with. He taught me to shed my institutional anxiety and fully engage in the process of making. Dennis taught me that art is a verb, and that you don't need to understand art in institutional terms to have an opinion. He made me understand that it is not possible to have an incorrect experience, as long as you're honest with yourself. I miss him very much. I started the Miranda series at CCAC. I was learning to make molds and casting wax, concrete, plastic, aluminum, bronze, and glass. I read about Voyager 2, a NASA spacecraft that discovered the 4th moon of the planet Uranus on its way to the stars. Miranda had been called the strangest object in our solar system. It seemed to have been shattered by some cataclysmic event, its remains then regrouping themselves to form the only non-spherical, irregular moon yet discovered. It is also unique as the only black heavenly body. I had been deliberately breaking some waxes and trying to reassemble them before casting them in bronze and black glass. Miranda was an excellent title for the series, which kept me busy until the early 90s when I was invited to work in the Czech Republic. My first trip to the International Glass Symposium, or IGS, in 1994 gave me an opportunity to work with a skilled team and a gaffer. Artists from many countries were teamed with factory workers for a 3-day glass-blowing free-for-all. I was assigned to work with Frankie Novak, the legendary Czech master blower, and his team. Most of what we made emerged from the 90-minute Veltlier and the giant Crystalex factory as colored. But I came home all fired up, and I put together a team of my best students at San Francisco State, and the Czech Harvest series was born. The series didn't start to imitate any particular fruit or vegetable. We started pushing one bubble into another, and most of what we ended up with was plant or seed pod-like. The work evolved into big, colorful celebrations of the fertility and fecundity in nature, and they were fun to make. I was seduced by these forms and by working with a great team. The Czech Harvest series, Equinox, and Mackay series continued through the 1990s. Joe Cariotti and I made this work with the help of several of my students, and it sold quite well.
That went on kind of long because I made that series of work for 12 years. I literally made a few thousand of those pieces. The scale was, for glass blowing, huge. A 3-person team could barely handle the glass. They were 20 to 30 inches in length. Not very heavy, but pretty tricky. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next section. The next section is about Joe Cariotti, who I mentioned, and it sort of explains itself. He was another huge influence in my life.
Joe was my student in the mid-'80s, and he had the perfect combination of great hands and a great attitude. At first, he assisted my clumsy efforts at gaffing my own work. After a couple of years, he politely asked me to give him the pipe shortly after the color work was done, and he began finishing the pieces. Now, on those rare days that I have the privilege of blowing with Joe, he lets me help, a little, out of respect for the old days. Joe and I had been blowing glass together for about a dozen years, making abstractions of plant or sea life. Many of these forms were large and required a great deal of skill and a 3-person team to make. If the shape took an unexpected twist, or the size we were aiming for was slightly larger or smaller, the work was still successful in my opinion. In other words, the work was not made by accident, but there was room for small amounts of process intervention. One day, Joe was only half kidding when he said, "These pieces are fun to a point, but with the skill this team now has, we can make much tighter work. In fact, we can make almost anything you could design." Now, I know a challenge when I hear one, and I began thinking about and drawing some completely new pieces. The Overture series is inspired by my lifelong love of futurist architecture, a secret desire I've always had to design for industry and my daughter's collection of fingernail polish bottles. The most incredible thing about these big lidded vessels, some are almost 3 feet tall, is that we have never made the same piece twice, and almost every piece in the series was made the first time we tried it. I mentioned that travel and lifestyle changes have always influenced my work, and to move back to LA and a new teaching job at Fullerton was no exception. My daughter Morgan and I had made the move in 2003. The next year, a student introduced me to Dee Danziger, his former glass teacher, thinking that we might like to talk about glass or something, and darn if we didn't fall in love that year, buy a house together the next year, and get married in our backyard the year after that. Dee and I actually did get around to talking about glass eventually, and we discovered that we both had done lots of architectural glass work in the early years, and we both missed it. So we built our dream studio on our property with a kiln room, a cold working patio, and room to build small-scale architectural commissions. We continue to do our own cast and kiln form work, but it's been an interesting experiment working together on a few projects. My current work, the Shibui series, is about my experience of objects, patterns, and designs that are found in abundance in traditional Asian architecture, textiles, furniture, containers, etc. It references my 25-year fascination with the way artisans in Japan and other countries join materials together. It celebrates the spiritual connections that these craftsmen and women make with the mundane and their ability to infuse useful, commonplace objects with functional beauty and abstract representations of nature.
We're almost there. One more section.
From my college days, I've been obsessed with do-it-yourself home improvement and landscaping projects. My wife and I split our at-home time between glasswork in our backyard studio, remodeling our mid-century ranch-style house, and landscaping the half-acre that we share with our 3 dogs and hundreds of wild beasts and birds. I have a golden-hearted wife, a brilliant and beautiful daughter, a wonderful job teaching at a supportive university, a comfortable home on a lush half-acre, a dream studio to keep me out of trouble. I have a swimming pool, for God's sakes. Life is good, very good.
So that's about 30 years or so. 37 years of my life I have been an instructor in the California State University system, and that whole last section was basically students and visiting artists and projects that took place at Cal State Fullerton, and that obviously has had an enormous influence on my work and my life. I just have a little bit of material that I want to fill in. This video mentioned the Shibui series, which I changed the name of shortly after that to the Ishikawa Tani series. In 2009, I was a visiting artist at the Osaka University of Art in Western Japan, and I worked there for 4.5 months with a couple of my former students from my 1983 trip to Japan, when I worked at the Tokyo Glass Art Institute. And Japanese are really big on anniversaries, so I was invited back for my 25th anniversary, when I found out later I was the first American to teach glass in Japan. So it was really a fun trip, and I brought back a number of cast pieces of glass, and I worked in my studio for about 1.5 years on this series. And the work was exhibited at the Barnstall Park in Los Angeles, at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery in 2011, in 2010 and 11. And I just want to show you a few of those pieces. Let's see if I can do this. Ishikawa Tani is the name of the valley that I lived in. And it sounds like a John Leighton movie. It actually means, does it mean Stone River Valley, which really does sound like an old Western. But while I was in Japan, I was looking at lots of museums and artifacts, and I'm much more fascinated by the Edo period in Japan, the Victorian kind of period, than I am with modern Japan. Modern day Tokyo really scares me. I love to go to museums, and I love the way that they honor their past and honor their craftsmen and their architects and things that are handmade. So this piece is called Irori, and that means hearth or fireplace in Japanese. And that hook that you see, that long bamboo pole with that little catch at the bottom, it's almost always shaped like a fish. And then there's a hook underneath. It's called Jizai Kagi, and it's really, that translates to adjustable hook. And it's the thing that they put the tea kettle on over the fire. And by lifting up on the fish, the hook can then be slid up and down, and you can turn the heat up and down on the kettle. And I bought one of those when I was in Japan at an antique flea market, really. And then I got ready to bring it home, and customs wouldn't let me bring it because it had bugs in it. The bamboo had bugs in it, so I was devastated. And as soon as I got home, I made a copy of it from bamboo that I got from a neighbor in La Habra Heights. And so that's the history of this piece. This piece is about my fascination with shoji screens and Japanese textiles. Something that my wife and I share is an admiration for and total amazement of the variety and the beauty of the way that textiles from Japan play with the grid, just the idea of the grid. These are 3 cast glass pieces and 3 wooden shoji screens that I designed myself. A friend of ours has a 100-year-old Japanese spade or shovel. It's called a suki, and it's not the kind of shovel you move dirt with, but it's the kind you use to break up the dirt, more like a hoe than a shovel. And in doing research, I read about that it was common for hundreds of years for families to have, dad had a suki and mom had a smaller suki, and the little kids each had scaled down sukis, so that the whole family would go out and turn over the rice paddy before they flooded it with water. And I had this image of this 19th century garage with all the family shovels lined up on the wall in there. So I made them out of glass. I cast the heads of the shovels from glass instead of iron. Go means 5 in Japanese, so the title is 5 shows. A matoi is an amazing thing. Japanese, during the Edo period, Edo is the name of Tokyo. It's what the Japanese word for Tokyo. And so the Edo period is when Tokyo became the capital of Japan. And one of the biggest problems they had was fires. The houses were made from bamboo and rice paper, and they had no fire plugs or no water pipes. So when a fire happened, these volunteer firemen would race over there and knock down all the houses around the one that was burning to prevent the fire from spreading. And if they were successful, they would be rewarded by the mayor with, beer and some money. And the story that I read, that these firemen were kind of the equivalent of the precursors to modern day Hell's Angels. They were very rowdy, they tended to drink a lot, they had lots of tattoos, and they were really macho. And they loved to brag about all the fires they put out. And they identified their location, their firehouse, with a tall pole with a symbol on the top that was called matoi. And the symbol was based on 48 letters in the kanji alphabet. And there were 48 firehouses in Tokyo, so each letter had its own district. And I thought that was just totally amazing. And so I've made a couple of pieces that I titled Matoi. And all of them have some sort of object on the top of a tall pole. Do-taku means copper bell. And do is bronze or copper. And they have found 1,500 of these copper bells all over Korea and Japan. But no one is actually sure what they're for or where they came from. They're not found in tombs. They're almost always found in fields. So the theory is that they had something to do with, some kind of fertility rite. And the oldest ones are 3,000 years ago, and the newest ones are 1,500 years ago. So for 1,500 years, they buried these bronze bells in the fields all over that part of Asia. I thought that was a pretty interesting subject. So I made my own do-taku bell out of glass. I just said Taco Bell, do-taku bell. And I discovered that if I circled 11 of them in a circle, when I made them out of wax, they made a perfect circle. So I cast a piece of glass that had 11 bells connected to each other in a ring. And I shipped it home, and I did the woodwork in my studio here in the hills. And that's where do-taku came from. Tondabayashi was the name of the city that I lived in the Ishikawa Tani, or the Stone River Valley. It's a little town about 30 miles south of Osaka, and that's where the university is. And one of the things I loved, there were many things I loved about Tondabayashi, but one was the manhole covers. Every time I had a bicycle and I'd ride 2 or 3 miles along the banks of the river from my little tiny 160 square foot apartment to the university, and I rode over these manhole covers that had these beautiful landscapes and images in them. And I found out that they were, it was common for a city to put the emblem of the city or the logo. And so I got the students who thought this was really great fun and that I was insane. But we went out and we blocked traffic and we made a mold of a manhole cover in the street in front of my apartment. And you can see in the detail down here, there's a mountain that's called Nijo-san. And that mountain is believed to be the birthplace of a man named Shotoku, who Prince Shotoku was a very famous character in the history of Japan. And there's a piece in the show now that's here that's called Shotoku's Carriage, that is a tribute to that prince. He brought the language, the first school, the first hospital, the first paved road, and basically got the Buddhists and the Shinto to stop fighting with each other. And to this day, when you go to a Buddhist temple, there is often a Shinto shrine inside. And when you go to a Shinto temple, there are Buddhist shrines inside. And it's a wonderful example of how 2 enormous major world religions can get along really well with each other. And I think the guy deserves a lot of credit. He lived in 580 AD in Japan. And this piece is kind of the manhole cover with his birthplace on it. Okay, now we're getting up there, and I have no more images because it seemed kind of redundant to show you pictures of the work that's 100 and some yards from here in the gallery. So what I'd like to do is I want to read a little statement, if I haven't gone too long. Am I okay? About how I feel about making work today as opposed to back when I was a grad student, etc. And then if any of you are interested, we can walk over to the gallery, and I'll be happy to answer questions, and you can see the latest incarnations of this body of work that these pieces kind of started. And I have some, what I do is, I can only work about 8 or 9 hours now. I'm getting arthritic and old, and so I found myself working all day. I had a sabbatical, by the way, for the first time in my life, and I did nothing but make art for 5 months, which was just amazing. The state of California paid me to stay home and make art, and it just doesn't get any better than that. And so I would work until I couldn't anymore in the studio, and then I'd go in and I'd sit and write about what I had been thinking about during the day. And I have piles of these thoughts that I have floating around, and I just thought I'd read a few of them. It's not a particularly great piece of literature, but it gives you an idea of what I think about when I'm working. It's interesting and significant to me to remember that nearly every piece of glass, art or craft, that I've seen in a gallery context was exhibited either on the floor, on top of some kind of pedestal, hung on the wall, or from the ceiling. I recently realized that without deliberately setting out to avoid any of those methods of display or presentation, none of the glass elements in this exhibition are located or mounted in any of those traditional ways. It seems obvious that I made the decision to include one or more glass elements in each of these mixed media sculptures, and I was to some extent questioning where those elements belong, not just within the sculpture itself, but in the world. I wasn't attempting to defy gravity with some kind of hidden support, but it surprises me that nearly all of the glass is perched on top of some kind of wooden pole or hanging from some kind of rope. I have no idea what that means, but it's interesting. I'm interested in place savers. Sculptors see poetry in utilitarian objects by separating the utility from the form. I sometimes use glass in much the same way that a museum conservator might use some kind of epoxy to replace missing sections of an ancient artifact. By replacing the business end of an imagined metal or stone farm implement with a fragile, pellucid casting, for instance, the viewer is given pause to reflect on the form rather than on the function of the object. In other words, if I cast a shovel and I make the end of the shovel out of glass, you're not going to look at that and wonder how fast you could dig a hole with it, but you might see what I saw in my friend's shovel on the wall of his house in Portland, Oregon, which was an incredibly beautiful object, regardless of what it was intended to be used for. Barrel-wrights, wheelwrights, wooden boat builders, carriage, wagon, coach, chariot, and all other builders of wooden horse-drawn transport have my admiration and respect. I have referred to glass as a non-user-friendly material. It really is, it makes horrible noises, that fingernails on the blackboard kind of sound, and if you look cross-eyed at it, it will break and cut you. And when you're a glass blower, it burns the daylights out of you. You get blisters just from getting too close to the glass without even touching it. So it isn't very friendly. But wood is my dear old friend. My studio always feels best when there are shavings on the floor and the FedEx guy says, "Wow, it smells terrific in here." In my recent work, I've used wood reductively, carving and grinding and sanding away the wood to create the form. And I've also I've enjoyed researching time-honored methods of joinery and traditional non-ferrous metal fasteners to make somewhat crude efforts to fit wooden elements together, which is the other way of working in sculpture besides from reductively, is to work in an additive way where you actually construct things out of parts and put them together. One thing I don't know why, but I don't ever use any kind of a fastener you can buy at Home Depot. I really like to figure out sort of the old way of putting materials together. And the use of glass in my work helps create distance. Viewers have the opportunity to disconnect these objects from any utilitarian purpose. Cast and mold-blown glass objects present as opposed to represent familiar textures and forms as new, not-so-functional objects. The translucency of the material simultaneously denotes or outlines their implied original use and connotes a more transcendent or perhaps even a poetic purpose. They don't exist merely as copied objects. They reference the past like a kind of visual quotation. I love that idea. I have a friend who quoted that term years ago. He takes images out of ancient or old stained glass windows designed by masters, and he puts tiny details in his stained glass designs. And he says, I'm quoting visually that artist in the same way that authors quote other authors in their books and put quotation marks around. And the other thing I want to read you is some thoughts on meaning in the work. That's a tough one. It's always a tough one for students. And you're going to be asked, if any of you are art majors, any art majors in here? Good. You're going to be asked to write artist statements. And I would strongly recommend that you start like tonight when you get home. Just start writing what you feel, what you think. And then when somebody really wants an artist statement, all you have to do is pull some paragraphs here and there and put them together. So this is my most recent, probably within the last 2 weeks. A casual observer might say my recent work is about Japan, wood, and glass. This would be only slightly accurate and a gross oversimplification. The work is made from mostly glass and wood, and I'm influenced by Japanese aesthetics, especially traditional approaches to craft and how handmade utilitarian objects are valued in Japanese culture. I'm not influenced by the objects so much as how I encounter them and how I attempt to understand them within the context of my very Western life and education. The materials, the wood, the glass, the metals, the fibers, the fasteners, are the vehicles that I use to try and understand my experiences and travels to this mysterious culture. I absolutely believe that looking at art requires a sincere effort on the part of the looker. So if you take your job seriously when you view this work, you may understand it in relation to the experiences, memories, and feelings that you might have had with similar objects, not necessarily Japanese or foreign made, but unfamiliar objects made from similar materials in your life. In other words, the meaning of this work is realized only when I'm honest about my making and sincere in my desire to learn from the process. And your willingness to view the work without expectations leads us to some kind of shared experience. My mentor and friend, Dennis Leon, was fond of assigning sentience to made things. He liked to talk about his work as if it could think. And he liked to make up words like two-ness and oneness. Dennis described that shared experience between viewer and maker as if it were between the maker and the made object. And this is a quote from my mentor, Dennis Leon. An object, par excellence, freezes time. It is perpetually in the present, even as it tells us of its history, shares its craft, and engages us perceptually. It holds the moment suspended. It is not a moment divorced from the past or from the future, but it's a moment in the object's own time. It's a moment in which the splitting of consciousness can disappear, and miracle of miracles, the two-ness of the person plus that object can produce a feeling of oneness in the person. Or I would say the two-ness of the person, the maker plus the viewer, can produce a feeling of oneness in both of them if you have a shared experience. I'm not seeking universal symbols or truths. I'm interested in making sculpture that remains viable, perhaps even poetic, as time passes. I want my work to exhibit what I have called strange familiarity. I hope these objects seem made without being dated. I hope this work speaks to a timeless usefulness without being utilitarian. And I don't expect that these objects will enjoy universal understanding, but perhaps some viewers will experience that intimacy with a physical object that can stimulate pleasant memories. And with the right person on the right day, that feeling of oneness that Dennis spoke of. Whatever they may or may not mean is beyond my influence. Whatever I have to say in my work sounds different to each listener. But it is my sincere hope that for each of you, these sculptures are precisely what they were meant to be. Thank you very much.